Let's see how I can do this. Is that shared on my screen, Garrett? Looks like it. Okay. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all here. Let's see. So today, obviously, we have a presentation from Equality Montana. Anyone who is wondering what Equality Montana is, Equality Montana is a nonprofit with a vision of using civic engagement, public education, community building to expand an active and engaged statewide LGBT+ base, specifically working to increase the reach, visibility, and impact of LGBTQ+ organizing and policy work in the state of Montana. And some of the things that we do are this presentation, which I think is fabulous, but I prepared it, so I'm a little biased on that front. Today, there we go. Specifically, the presentation is do's and don'ts of queer allyship, prepared and presented by me, Cassandra. A lot of times people have questions about what is and what isn't okay as an ally, what they should or shouldn't say, those sorts of things. So I figured it would be a really good idea while people are sitting around looking for something to do or learn to do this now. So how this is going to work is I've got a slideshow presented. I'll talk through some things, share some stuff. And at the end of each section, I'm going to ask for questions. There's a chat function on Zoom. If you have questions, just go ahead and post them there. And then those will get moderated through to me, and we can make sure that those get answered. So let's just dive right into it. So I think it's important when you start off a presentation to know exactly what you're talking about. So what is an ally? And an ally is someone who is an active listener to whatever community they're being an ally to, right? So that means that you're not just talking over, or you're not just you know, trying to help this community for your own reasons or needs, but rather you're listening and being very attentive to what people in this community are telling and sharing with you. An ally also stands up for communities but does not step on or over them, which just means that members of a community should be centered and focused in all the conversations about that community. An ally also makes sure to include community members in any decision making. This is a specific reference to policy work. So like at the legislature and those sorts of things, it's important that members of the community have power and respect and decision making power over things that affect them. And an ally is also a title that can be given, but it can't be claimed. Just because someone says that they're an ally does not necessarily mean that, you know, they follow this list of things. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So I figure one of the most important things to start off with and talk about is questions. So some of this is kind of vague, and some of it are some pretty specific do's and don'ts. So we'll just kind of work through this. But questions are a very important tool, but also can be very hurtful depending on how they are or are not asked. So I think the easiest thing that I always tell people is there's a really simple litmus test for should you or should you not ask a question. And the very first one that I always tell people is, you know, is this question that you want to ask something that you would feel comfortable with you or a stranger asking your mom or your grandma? Now, I know that these family ties aren't always a universal experience, but for instance, if you wouldn't want someone asking your mom or to talk to your mom about your sex life, or their sex life, then you probably don't want to ask a complete stranger about it. So if you wouldn't want to ask your mom or talk about it in church, probably shouldn't be asking a stranger. The next one is, can you Google the question and get an answer, even if that answer isn't satisfactory, right? So that's important because a lot of times people will ask me questions that they already know the answer to, but they're looking for more or more private information that I'm not really willing to share. So can you find the answer? And does it answer your question? If yes, then you don't need to ask it, right? So if you can Google it and you wouldn't ask your mom, then maybe you shouldn't be asking other people. And those are some pretty good ground rules for what questions you should or shouldn't be asking. And another thing, as we move on to the next bullet point, is just because one person is okay with a question does not mean that it's okay to ask it to everyone, right? So there are a lot of things that I'm really comfortable sharing about my past and my experience, but that doesn't mean that that's okay to ask the next person. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that it's okay to ask me or someone else who's okay with it. So it's important to be intentional with your questions and recognize that what goes for one community member does not go for every community member. The next thing that I think is really important, especially as we move into a very political social media front and everything going on with elections, is don't solicit answers from folks that you know just because they are LGBT+. And what this means when I say it, or what it looks like, is, don't go and tag all of your friends who, are trans, non-binary, two-spirit on Facebook about, a horrible bathroom bill that's going on in North Carolina and say, let's discuss, or what do you think about this? And that's a problem for a couple different reasons, because one, that often comes across as, hey, let's decide if you need basic human rights. And then the other part about that is, not only can this cause serious trauma, but you could be potentially outing that person to someone who is not friendly, isn't very accepting, or could have, very real world ramifications that you didn't intend by tagging and outing that person on Facebook. So just be very intentional and careful with how you're using social media to interact with people and who you're sharing what information with. Continuing on with this questions, it's also important, following off of that last point, that the LGBT+ folks in your life are not just a convenient source of information. You should be attending trainings, you should be doing the work, you should be doing the research, you should be learning and growing, just making sure that that's not at the expense of like your friends and loved ones. So that means like LGBT+ people don't have to explain definitions, they don't have to give you satisfactory answers, and they just, quite frankly, don't owe you an answer in general. But it is also important to note that something a lot of people say, myself included, is if you're just sitting and talking, you'll learn way more interesting and perhaps important things than if you're just asking a bunch of questions. So being an active listener sometimes is a way better way to learn than to use your time with someone to ask them a bunch of questions. Along those same lines, it's very important that when you ask a question, because you can't always make sure that you're asking a perfect question, that you give an out and prepare for a no. And what I mean when I say that is, a lot of times people will use the phrase, can I ask you a question? And if I say like, yeah, of course you can ask me a question, and I'm expecting you to ask me what my favorite ice cream color is, and then you have questions about my reproductive organs, it's a very different, it's a very different question than I might have been expecting, and it can create, an unfair pressure or unrealistic expectations for me to answer that question when I didn't know that was what was going to be asked. So it's important to all, after you've asked a question, or it could be a very sensitive question, to say something like, I have a question I would like to ask you, but you don't have to answer it, or I have a question about, you know, this specific thing. And just making sure that once you've asked the question, that the person you're asking feels comfortable to tell you no or to not answer that question. And again, with questions, I think the best way to learn is by listening, because there's a lot of things that especially trans people talk about of their like lived experience. As someone, you know, who has gone from one hard societal gender norm and roles to another, that you might not even think to ask, but might, you know, be even more telling. Now we're going to get into some kind of hard do's and don't questions to ask. So, you know, don't ask about body parts or questions about anatomy. So that looks like a lot of times people will ask me, you know, like, have I had the surgery or other medical, you know, things, you know, and realistically, anybody's medical information or history is private. And just because someone is trans does not mean that it's okay to ask them about those sorts of things. So just be careful that you're not asking people about, you know, body parts, about surgeries, about medical things, those sorts of questions. Don't ask people, you know, how they have sex or how does that work. That is a question that does come up a lot. And on that same line, you know, don't ask, you know, who's the top and who's the bottom, or especially who's the man or who's the woman in a relationship. And especially never ask for a threesome or to watch. And I know that some of these questions may sound kind of ridiculous, but I can guarantee you they are questions that come up a lot. And this kind of goes back to making sure that you're respecting and that you wouldn't ask your mom most of these questions. Or any of these questions. Another thing that's really important to not do is don't ask someone, you know, what bathroom do you use? A lot of times people will use this as kind of a way to gauge someone's pronouns, you know, what bathroom do you use? Or, you know, those sorts of things, which first of all isn't a very good indicator of what pronoun someone uses, because someone may be more comfortable using a bathroom that doesn't align with their gender. And it's just a really invasive and uncomfortable question. But along those same lines, you should work for gender neutral and affirming bathroom signs and policies in your workplace, in your communities, etc. But don't assume that every trans person wants or should use gender neutral bathrooms. A lot of times trans kids in schools just want to, you know, lead normal lives, and I mean, just trans people in general use the bathrooms that help make them feel like who they are. So it's important to not automatically assume or push someone to use a bathroom that doesn't match their gender identity. Another very important hard do not do is ask someone about a dead name, right? And so if you don't know what a dead name is, basically a dead name is the legal name that a trans person used before, right? So these questions look like, you know, what was your name before? Or what's your real name? These questions aren't appropriate. And a lot of times it can be a very hurtful and traumatic experience for, you know, the trans person that you're talking to. They may not want to share it. And a lot of times, knowing that information can actually take away from getting to know this person as who they are, as opposed to just getting to know and love them for who they are instead of thinking about who they were. But I also want to make sure to say that you should be asking what name and pronouns to use or people do use, right? A lot of times you'll see this as, what are your preferred pronouns? I don't like the phrase preferred pronouns because they're not preferred, they're my pronouns, right? So, but it is totally okay and definitely acceptable to ask someone like, hey, what pronouns do you use, or what name do you go by? Along those same lines of questions you should not ask, when you're talking to parents of, you know, LGBT parents of kids, and kids of LGBT parents, there's a couple, you know, hard and fast do's and don'ts rules. So don't ask which of the couple, you know, had the kid, or, you know, who carried the child, or, you know, all those sorts of questions are not appropriate and very personal. And never ask things like, who's the real parent? Because both of those parents are the real parent to this kid. Also, don't ask how people plan to have kids or how they want them, because it's not the norm, even in straight relationships, for people to want to have kids. Or I shouldn't say it's not the norm, but it's normal for people in straight relationships not to want or have kids. And it's, you know, also normal in queer relationships. And it's not any of our business what people do or don't want to have in regards to kids. But you should be supporting LGBT plus parents and their kids, and make sure that you're challenging and calling out these questions and other harmful stereotypes towards parents of LGBT plus kids, kids who are LGBT plus, and LGBT plus parents with kids. It's also important along the lines of personal questions, right? Usually the good rule of thumb is in society not to ask someone about religion, politics, or money. And along those same lines, asking people about, like, if they have experienced hurt from religion, or if they, you know, now identify one way religiously because of, you know, a Christian background or something like that, isn't really appropriate. And if they want to share that, that's fine, but it's important to not ask, especially questions that can bring up a lot of hurt and trauma for some people. And along those same lines, especially around the holidays, specifically not asking, you know, how your family handles something, or is your family okay with that? How did your family react when you come out? You know, are you allowed to go home for Thanksgiving and Christmas? You know, these questions do come up, and they're not necessarily appropriate to ask, but it is okay to ask something like, you know, do you have plans for Thanksgiving? Or do you want to come over to our place for Thanksgiving, or whatever the holiday is, right? But it's important not to be reminding people of and bringing up potential trauma that they're experiencing. And along those same lines, it's not a question, but it's a good do, is make sure that you are including LGBT plus peoples in parties and events that you're organizing. You know, if you're having like a women's night out or a boys' night out, are you making sure that you're including your like trans femme friends or your trans masc friends, or just making sure that, you know, the groups of people you're going out with are inclusive and accepting. Okay, so that was a big section. It's the biggest section of it. Are there any questions that we have before we go on?
Hey Cass, this is Garrett. I use he, him, his pronouns. We have a question that was sent to me in a private chat in here. And the question is, if someone comes out to you, what's an appropriate question to ask them, or what's an appropriate response?
Yes. So the next section is actually talking about coming out. I think the most appropriate question is, depending on how they intend or how they're coming out, right? Who they're coming out as, kind of determines those questions, right? If someone comes out as being trans or questioning their gender identity, asking what pronouns or names they might prefer is something that's really good. But the best thing to ask is, you know, how can I support you? There's not, you know, a good strong list of like, these are the questions you should ask, or these are the things you should be doing. But just letting that person know that you love them, you care about them, it doesn't change how you see them, and asking how you can better support them, I think is the best way to do, or to handle that, and the best question to ask during that.
Fab. And we have one more. You'll use the term trans masculine and trans feminine. Can you define those a little bit?
Yes. So trans means across, right? It's, you know, we always use Latin and Greek for science things and for like terms and definitions a lot of the time, right? So trans means across or towards. So when someone is trans femme or a trans woman, it basically means moving towards that, right? So a trans woman is often someone who's MTF, which is male to female. So someone who is probably AMAB, so assigned male at birth, and then transitioning either with hormones, socially, whatever that looks like for them, towards a more feminine appearance and expression. So in converse, a trans masc person or a trans man will be someone who's AFAB, assigned female at birth, who is then doing whatever transitioning looks like for them towards a more masculine experience and presentation.
Thanks. And we have another one. Someone asked, does an LGBTQ person have to come out? I know some folks who are kind of like, why do I have to come out at all? Does that make sense?
Yes. So, I mean, whatever someone's best experience is probably the right experience for them, right? As long as they're not hurting anybody or like there's, consent, right? If you want to come out, that's great. If you don't want to come out, that's great. As long as people are getting to live, their best lives, nobody has to come out. There are a lot of arguments and stuff about this, about wanting to make sure that there's representation for and in the community, but ultimately whether or not someone should or it's ideal for them to come out is a very personal decision for them. I, for instance, have had a very long journey of self-discovery, and with, stuff in the last couple of years, I've just never really bothered to come out with it because, I'm already out, I'm proud, I don't necessarily need to share it with people for my experience to be a more positive one. So it's very okay for people to not come out. And it's very okay for people to come out, and we just need to make sure that we're supporting them in either of those cases. Excellent. Are there any more questions? Cool. So now we're going to move on to coming out. So when someone is coming out, it's important to never, ever, 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 ever out someone without their explicit consent. It doesn't matter how public they are. It doesn't matter how open they are. It doesn't matter, if you see their face on the news every day and they're talking about it, that you're not sharing that information without their consent. Even if someone is open and public with their identity, they need to have control over, who they're sharing and talking about that information with, simply because that information can be very dangerous for some people to have or know, or sometimes people just don't want to share it with certain people or groups. However, it is okay to ask, do you want me to share that you've come out with these people, or especially with gender diverse people, trans, non-binary, two-spirit people who are just coming out, asking, do you want me to tell people and correct them if they're not using your preferred pronouns, is a really good question that you can ask too. But just making sure that you have their explicit consent every time that you're outing someone is very important. Some of the don'ts to say when someone comes out are things like, well, obviously, or like, I could always tell, or duh. Coming out can be a very terrifying and dangerous process, and a lot of times people who are coming out will start with someone that they know or feel is supportive. And even if it's maybe obvious to you, it doesn't mean that it's obvious to that person. So it's important to just make sure that you're creating a trusting and accepting environment for that person. It's also important to note that coming out is all about the person coming out. And what I mean when I say this is a lot of times I hear people who come and tell me about a coming out experience where, they're trying to share something that's very personal and oftentimes very scary for them. And the response they get with, is, why didn't you trust me sooner? Why didn't you tell me before? Like, I'm okay. I'm a good person that you can share this to. And a lot of times this doesn't build a relationship and can actually hurt it, because it's not about, that person who's coming out trusting you or trusting someone else with that information. It's really about, you know, a personal and scary experience of sometimes coming to terms with who they are and just trying to make sure that they feel safe and secure in that situation. But you can say and should say, you know, thank you for trusting me with something so important. Is there a way that I can best support you in this? I think is the best thing you can do. And along those same lines, you should make sure that they're connected to all the resources that they want or need, making sure that you're asking if they want those resources before you necessarily dump a bunch on them. But also make sure that you're not trying to immediately set them up with someone just because both of those people are LGBT plus, right? You know, just because one person comes out as a lesbian doesn't mean they need to be immediately set up with another lesbian friend that you have, or, you know, any other combination of that. Along those same lines, not all LGBT plus people know each other. In Montana, it does tend to be a small knit community, but it's also, you know, kind of a faux pas and a stereotype that all of, you know, the queer and trans, you know, gender diverse people know each other. And a lot of times it can be a frustrating experience and can make someone feel like they're not really part of a community if they're recently out. So it's careful not to be asking them those questions or setting them up with those things, but making sure that you know the resources and are sharing those resources with people. So before we move on, are there any other questions about coming out? Excellent. And if we're going through any of these sections and you'll have any questions that you want to ask about previous ones, we can definitely address them, you know, as we're going on too. So don't hesitate to reach out with your questions in the chat. Next is a really big one, is pronouns. This is something allies ask and talk about a lot. So some pretty good do's and don'ts are listed here. So first and foremost, don't assume pronouns for anyone. And I say that especially as someone who is now identifying as agender. So that means I don't really identify or fit with any of the typical gender identities that I've seen or discovered. They don't fit, right? So I'm not using pronouns, which can be difficult, but I'm also a very femme-coded person. So a lot of times people assume that my pronouns are she, her. And while those pronouns might not be, you know, very wrong or inaccurate, they're not the right ones, right? So it's very important to not assume how someone identifies just because of how they look. When you're asking pronouns, it's important to, you know, ask their pronouns. Just point blank, you know, ask the question that you want to ask, making sure it's respectful. Don't ask, you know, what bathroom do you use? Are you a boy or a girl? You know, like what's down there? Those, first of all, aren't appropriate questions and aren't really affirming ways to know what someone's pronouns are, as opposed to simply asking, you know, what are your pronouns? Or as Garrett did, which is really good, you know, my pronouns are these. What pronouns do you use? And again, I really want to hammer in that just because of how someone is presenting or expressing, you know, masculine or feminine or androgynous doesn't mean that their pronouns are also coded that way. A good thing to do with pronouns is do make sure that you're putting those pronouns, you know, in your email signatures, in your bios, on Facebooks. You're introducing themselves with you when you're like in support group meetings or business meetings. It's very important and affirming, and lets any potential, you know, people who are struggling with pronouns or whatever, that is a safer environment and you are a safe person to approach and talk to about these things. And helping normalize it is also just a really good way to be an ally. And it's something that's really simple and easy to do. Another important thing that I seem to struggle a lot with allies is singular they. It's in the dictionary, it's over 700 years old, it's older than singular you. Like, it is so appropriate and okay and grammatically correct to use singular they. I am also, you know, do a lot of writing tutoring and a lot of that stuff. So I work with a lot of English professors. It's totally okay to use singular they, and I definitely encourage it for using people who use those pronouns to make sure that you're using those pronouns. Most importantly, I think something that's really good to talk about when we're talking about being an ally is how to recognize a mistake, but not make the mistake a focus of a conversation, right? So especially with pronouns, if you do mess up, do correct yourself, but don't make it a big deal. And I see this all the time, right? So do acknowledge that you've made a mistake and then very quickly move on. And so that looks like the example I have here is she forgot her coat, and then continue on with the conversation. A lot of times you'll see things like, oh, I call everybody girl, or I call everybody queen or dude, you know, I'm totally supportive. I don't mean to, you know, do this sort of thing. You know, I'm so good. I'm normally better at this. It's just pronouns are really hard, right? Like it creates a very uncomfortable conversational environment. And a lot of times it can just be even more problematic as opposed to just a very quick and short, messed up, fixing it, moving on. So before we move on, are there any questions that people have about pronouns? Okay, I would also like to say that, you know, as society progresses and as people are becoming more aware of other identities and cultures and stuff like that, there are a lot more than 3 sets of pronouns. And it's important to recognize that and make sure that you're doing your best to use those appropriate pronouns for people when they ask them. So next is relationships, which is both a very specific and vague slide title. So of course, obviously it's important to recognize that every relationship is different, but most especially every queer relationship is very different one to the next. So when you're thinking about that, it's important to not assume, you know, how a couple identifies a relationship. So, you know, there are people who may not strictly identify a relationship as being straight, even though there's a, you know, masculine presenting person and a feminine presenting person. So for instance, I identify as agender, so I don't really identify anything I'm doing as straight. And it's important to recognize and be mindful of that. It's also important to recognize that should not, so don't assume all relationships strive for or end in marriage. You know, sometimes things are just a small short-term relationship. Sometimes the couple is really committed and they want to be together forever, but they don't want a traditional marriage. It's just really important that you're open to all types of relationship models. And along that same line, don't assume that all people or all relationships are monogamous and or polyamorous or non-monogamous, right? And so what I mean by that is make sure that when you're being supportive of relationship models, that you're supportive of all relationship models, whether that's a typical, you know, heterosexual, you know, stereotypical relationship, or whether that's, you know, 2 monogamous lesbians, or however that looks. Just make sure that you're being accepting and open-minded to all that. Along those same lines, don't assume that someone has a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a wife, husband, etc., right? So what I mean by this is when you're planning an event or a party or something, don't ask questions like, you know, to someone that you don't know very well. Are you going to bring your girlfriend to the party on Friday, right? And if you don't know that that person has a girlfriend, and if you don't know that that partner identifies as a girlfriend, it's really important to make sure that you're leaving room for interpretation, right? And that you're making sure that your language is open and accepting. People really aren't going to complain if you're making sure that you're, you know, open and accepting to all sorts of relationship models and partners. But, you know, if you're closing off your options, it can cause a lot more issues. So do instead ask something like, do you have a partner that you're planning to bring? Or do you have a +1 that you want to bring to the wedding? Or don't forget you have a +1 invitation, you know, those sorts of things. Just making sure that you're being inclusive. And along those same lines and events, do make sure that, you know, all your events and programs and orgs are supportive of all relationship models and people. So if you have a wedding, instead of maybe just a +1, maybe see if people need a +2 and those sorts of things. And making sure that, you know, the people in the event and the space are supportive and friendly of all relationship models and all people in relationships. Okay. Are there any questions about relationships before we move on?
This so much isn't a question about relationships, but someone said, Cass, you used the word queer. Is it okay for everyone to use the word queer? If I'm straight, should I use the word queer or should we say LGBTQ+?
Right, so I think that's a great question. And this is what I'm doing when I say don't specifically have a good answer for you. And the reason for that is that is a word that's being reclaimed by the LGBT community, LGBT plus community. So it's important to recognize that some places that's okay and some places that's not. Overall, I try to tell allies who aren't, you know, necessarily part of a community, which we're coming up to on the next slide, I think, actually, making sure that you're being as inclusive as you can be without closing off your options. And what I mean when I say that is queer will still offend some people, right? Like there are still some words out there that community members may use a lot and may slip into presentations, but isn't necessarily appropriate in all contexts or places. So I think it depends on the person and the space and the place and how it's used. But if you're concerned about it or it doesn't feel right, then I would just stick with, you know, LGBTQ plus community. Moving on to, you know, some of those same things is respecting LGBT plus folks. So the first one's pretty simple, which is, you know, a stereotype, which I've seen so many times in different gay bars and stuff, which is don't plan trips and parties in and to queer spaces and places without respecting them, right? So a lot of times you'll see things like a bachelorette party or, you know, there's a stereotype of a straight man going to a gay bar and then not wanting to be hit on, right? Those are places and spaces for the LGBT plus community to gather and to be themselves. And if you're not comfortable or respectful of that, then maybe it's a place that you should be careful going to. It's also important to note that when you're talking to people, you should use respectful language. And what I mean when I say that is making sure that, of course, again, you're using the right name and pronouns for people. And if you don't know, ask. Don't call someone adjectives. This happens all the time. So transgender is an adjective. And there should be a space in that, by the way. Anyways, so calling people transgender, you know, you have to be careful about how you're using some of these words because someone is not a transgender, but a person who is transgender, right? So making sure that you're using person first language, a person who happens to be trans, and just making sure that, you know, you're using the best terms and communicating them the best way. Don't introduce someone as your LGBT plus friend, right? So I'm not Cass, your bi friend. I'm just Cass, right? Your friend. Don't use slang words or terms that may be offensive or problematic. And specifically what I was thinking of when I wrote this was like the T slur or the F slur. And, you know, I don't necessarily want to share those words on a professional presentation, but making sure that some of the words like fairy or whatever, some community members may use that or have identities based around that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay for you to in turn use or say those things. So it is really good to know and learn what appropriate terms are or are not. And the best way to do that is by Googling. And then if you can't, find someone that you're comfortable asking and you feel like it's appropriate to ask those questions to. Like here. Another thing that's super important is don't coach people, especially trans people. And what I mean when I say this is a lot of times really well-meaning allies will say things like, you know, if you just walked like this, you know, no one would know that you're trans and you'll look so feminine. Or, you know, if you just talk like this, or if you look like this, or advice on how to find someone, right, can oftentimes be very upsetting and problematic because sometimes people know how they want to express and so they're going to express that way, and sometimes it can make them feel like they're inadequate or point out flaws or, you know, things that they weren't even aware of but now will be. So it's important to just let people live and be themselves. But if they come to you for advice, it is okay to share. Just don't give unsolicited advice. Another thing that's important is asking what types of compliments people prefer. So what I mean when I say this is, you know, sometimes you'll say handsome or beautiful or pretty or those sorts of things. So I prefer typically feminine compliments, right? I like to be called pretty and gorgeous and beautiful, but I don't really like to be called like handsome or debonair, those sorts of things. So knowing how people like to be talked to and, you know, complimented is also very important in respecting LGBT plus people. And before we move on from this slide, is there any questions? Excellent. Okay, so I know that that was a lot of information that we just went over. So I've got a really good slide of takeaways for you, right? So the main one is do put your pronouns in your bios, your email signatures, use them at meetings, etc. It's a really good, really easy way to be an ally and show people you're supportive. Do make sure that your questions are respectful in all the ways that we've talked about, and just making sure that a good rule of thumb is, you know, what do I hope to learn from this question, or why am I asking this question? And making sure that, you know, the way that you're asking and talking about those questions and thinking about them is a way that's respectful and comes from a place of love. Do continue to learn and do the work. I think you're all doing a really great job by being here today and talking about this and sharing this with your friends. But the work is never done, right? And as an ally, neither are you. And sometimes that looks like supporting legislative agendas or speaking out against them. Sometimes that looks like calling out things that your friends and family say and do. And sometimes that looks like, you know, just Googling questions that you have or checking in on someone that you have, right? Another very important thing is if, you know, your efforts and movements are not led or centered with community members, then it's not allyship, right? Progress and goals for a community can only be decided by community members and not allies. People who are affected have to have control and be in charge of those decisions and ideas. And then most importantly, while we're all in this pressure cooker of quarantine, it is important that you're checking on, you know, all of your LGBT plus people, as well as all the other people regularly in your lives. You know, if something's going on in the news, it's important to reach out to your friends, you know, who you do know, and asking if they're okay, or just even when things aren't, you know, when everybody's not quarantined at home, making sure that you're getting cups of coffee and talking to people and making sure that you're sharing your lives with people and making sure that, you know, all the people that you love are doing okay. So before we move on to the last slide, are there any questions or things that people had?
Here's a question. Do you have suggestions for best practices for organizations?
Best practices for organizations, right. So I think the best thing you can do automatically is making sure that people are you know, and it looks a couple different ways, right? Making sure that people are sharing their pronouns and those sorts of things. Making sure that if you can, that you've got gender neutral and affirming, you know, bathroom stalls and signage. Making sure that any of the language on your documents or applications are, you know, gender neutral, right? You don't need to say his or her, you can say the applicant or theirs. Making sure that you have a clear and acceptable policy for if something does happen at your work or through a business, that people can talk about it and work towards a resolution for it. You can make sure that you're, you know, putting appropriate signage out and about to let people know that you are friendly or you are an ally. You can sign up with organizations like Open to All to let other people know too. There's a lot of good small things that you can do, but it's important to recognize that a lot of it has to do with being patient and being loving, right? So a lot of the questions, and sometimes you're just going to need, you know, an opinion from someone who is gender diverse or, you know, who is LGBT plus, those sorts of things, to really know if there's an issue or what needs to be fixed. But I think the best things in general are to make sure that your workplace environment is safe for LGBT plus people, and making sure that you're doing everything that people who are either soliciting your business, you know, as a customer, or who are your like employees and coworkers are feeling safe and supported in that environment.
Awesome. We have a question of how can we support LGBTQ employees and coworkers that are working on NDOs, so non-discrimination ordinances for LGBTQ plus folks, or possibly less LGBTQ friendly areas, so maybe rural communities, etc.
Right. So a lot of times that looks like making sure that the environment at work that you're creating is open and affirming. A lot of workplaces typically don't tell when someone is or isn't working, but if someone is public or in the news or something about that, having those conversations is important of what can we do to support you? And then of course, not just sharing, you know, when someone's working or where someone's working, if you don't explicitly know that person and have explicit permission to share that with someone. Most workplaces already have policies like that, but it's important to make sure that you're prioritizing the safety of those people. And obviously you can't control all of that during, you know, when something big is going on or when big issues are happening, but you can make sure that you're connecting people with resources and making sure that your business is as open and affirming as you can be.
We have a question that asks, are there any LGBTQ plus authors or books either of you would recommend?
Whew, that's a good one. Specifically LGBT plus related content, I always like to tell people one of my favorite movies because I feel like it's a real accurate portrayal is Boy Meets Girl, the 2014 version with Michelle Hendley. It's not great and there's some conversations in it that aren't great, but I feel like it's a realistic portrayal. As opposed to, you know, other forms of media, I don't really have a specific recommendation.
Great. And I think you could probably also Google that, just LGBTQ authors and books, and find a pretty good list.
I will also say most of your local bookstores often will already have a section about this, or even, you know, like Barnes and Noble and other places. Specifically the, you know, Montana Bookstore in Helena has a really good section about all these different books about queer and gender diverse people. And I know a lot of other, you know, bookstores around the state also have, you know, sections like that and can give really good recommendations too. Were there other questions on that? Okay, so then I like to usually end on sources, but instead this time I'm going to end on resources. So, you know, just some good things to know. There are some really good community centers. There's a great one in Great Falls. There's a community center in Billings. There's one in Missoula. The Glacier Queer Alliance is up in Kalispell in the Flathead area. So I have the Facebooks listed here. You can also just Google all these places and type them in through the Facebook search bar. Really good education and social media resources. The Montana Gender Alliance, Sean is really great and does a ton of different trainings, Trans 101 training specifically. And they're going to be working on a social media presence soon. Transvisible Montana, Glacier Queer Alliance, and Equality Montana obviously also have really good social media and education, things like that. And another thing that I always like to share, especially, is there are a bunch of support groups for trans, non-binary, two-spirit Montanans. And for information on that, depending on where you live, there's some pretty regular groups in, let's see, Missoula, in Billings, Bozeman, Helena, and there are a couple other ones that meet irregularly in Butte and other places. So if you need any information of that, also emailing Sean is a really good place to do that. Okay, so that is all that I have listed. Are there any other questions from any other parts of this presentation that people have, or just any questions in general that people have and want to get an answer to? And you can feel free to type those up in the chat.
You can just patiently wait for them if someone's typing. This isn't a question, but Lena said, "Thank you, Cass. You are awesome."
Thank you.
As did Sean, who I think you just mentioned Sean's email as a resource.
Yes. You can also privately message Sean if you want to through Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, like I said, it's also important to recognize, I know that things are really hard during quarantine to find specific resources or things that are going on, but especially if you're following, you know, like Equality Montana, if you're talking to people with NGA, if you're, you know, looking at all these different things, there are a lot of events that are online. And once things are, you know, kind of back to normal, a lot of those events and stuff will start up. So just kind of being aware of those things happening is also a really good way to learn and be a really good ally.
We have a question that's not really related to any like specific kind of LGBT question, but someone asked, will the recording be available to share? So we will be posting it on our Facebook, where you can find it there. And our Facebook is just facebook.com/equalitymt. And I hope to have that up later today or tomorrow.
Excellent. Yeah, well, especially like I said, thank you all for being here. I know that it's not always easy, especially with everything going on, to come and learn and talk about stuff. I hope it was really helpful. And of course, if you have any other questions or things that come up after the fact, you can also, I imagine, contact me through Equality Montana with your questions and stuff like that and get an answer, as well as these other resources that are on your screen.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Cass, and everyone have a nice day. We're going to go ahead and log off.